what's up? Welcome to Whiteboard Talks. I'm Nathaniel Littauer here with Littauer Strength Training. Talking today about jerks. It's one of those Olympic lifts that people can use in training plans for different athletes of different sports. But wanted to kind of break down some of the pros and cons and some of the things I look at in terms of teaching athletes these movements and why some of them may be good, may be bad. There's a lot of ways this conversation can go, but this is some of the things that I look at, and this may actually kind of turn into why I don't teach athletes the split jerk. And so we're going to look at some of those pros and cons here. We'll start with the pros just because there are a lot of great things that jerks, like I said, in particular split jerks, can do for athletes. Obviously, the first component's power. So getting that vertical power, being able to move a weight quickly and vertically, that's a great thing to have, especially for those jumping athletes. Basketball, volleyball, movements like those are good for them. You can also get heavier weights overhead, but it's not super taxing, but it's heavier overhead that's not super taxing because it's basically an isometric catch. Your arms don't do a whole lot. You have that dip phase, obviously overhead. I hit my ceiling because it's a little small. But having that ability to go overhead with heavier weights can be a good thing for developing, especially isometric strength with those athletes and having that ability. So those are good too. Coordination. So being able to learn how to move the body. That's a really crappy way to write coordination. That's a funny looking D. But having the coordination to time different things and just be able to use the leg drive in order to get weight overhead, that can be a really good tool to develop that. That being said, especially like I said with the split jerk, I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end about why I like to do push jerks more. But from a split jerk perspective, heavier, right? That's a con actually. It's a pro and a con because we do run the risk, especially with overhead athletes, of injury. Particularly because, especially learning those movements, if you try to push the weight a little bit too much, sometimes you can run the risk of some shoulder pains, elbow pains, things like that, wrist pain as well. So it's a good thing and it's a bad thing to be able to do heavier stuff overhead. But that's one of the other things you have to look at is what are you using it for and why. So heavy can also be a con in terms of the risk factor for it. Another thing, and this is where we get even more coordination. Like I said, I'm talking more split jerk here. To do a split jerk very effectively, you have to know what the heck your lower body's doing along with your upper body. Everything's got to be coordinated. There's a lot of timing that goes into that. Like I said, it's a good thing because you can learn coordination, but that timing of the split jerk, when do you split your feet out? All right, when do you put your body under the bar? How do you receive the bar? Those timing things can play into a con because they take time to teach. It's not that they're impossible to learn, but if we're looking at trying to get forward quickly and make progress, teaching that split jerk may take a little bit too much time out of that development that you can use in other areas. Okay, so there are heavier and the coordination that kind of weighs into our cons. And under coordination, I'm just going to go ahead and put technique because we kind of talked about that. And then volume-wise, you can't get a whole ton of volume with these in a short amount of time unless you're doing very, very light weights and you're just cranking out tons of sets. But I'm sure a lot of your athletes are not going to enjoy you as a coach. Because especially if they get proficient at this, dropping a bar down to their collarbones. For any weightlifters out there experienced with that, you know what it's like to drop that weight down. So just looking at volume like that, it's hard to get in the amount of volume you want without tons of potential for those collarbone irritations and things like that. Now, let's talk about push jerks. I actually like the push jerk a lot because it has all of these pros right there. But there's one pro that it has compared to split jerk, and that is the fact that it's natural. If you were to ask, and this is something I have seen with a lot of the athletes I work with, if I ask them to push press and they get to a certain point where it's too heavy to push press, they will naturally power jerk. And that is something I think is very beneficial. Power jerks traditionally, unless you got some freak like Piros Dimas back in the day, you're not, and a couple other Opti and the Russians and whatever you want to go into there, but you're not going to get quite as heavy as you would a split jerk from most people. So we lower that factor down a little bit on the danger side of things. And then most people just having it a natural movement, you don't actually have to spend time teaching it. It's just, hey, work up to a heavy push press, well knowingly that they'll probably turn it into a push jerk. It still gives you the power, it still gives you some coordination, effort, and benefit, but being able to have that natural rhythm, as much as splitting your feet out is natural once you learn kind of that footwork and the sequencing. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time teaching that because the body will just naturally want to drop under that weight, at least from my observations and the time that I've spent with athletes on push presses and things like that. I found that the push jerk tends to be pretty natural in a movement. So those are just a couple things to think about when programming jerks into workouts for your athletes. Obviously, you have to look at the sport and the sport mechanics, sport needs in order to really assess if this is something you even want in your program at all. I think it's really important to remember not to be married to an idea, a lift, or some concept, and be able to toy around with it a little bit on there. So that's just something to think about with those overhead lifts and the jerks. Love to hear some comments and thoughts from other coaches out there in the comments section, and start up some conversations on social media, because I know there's a lot of different opinions out there on that. So if you want to connect with me, I'm at Lift Tower on Instagram. That's LIFTAUER, and then lit_strength on Twitter, and then obviously I'm right here, Lift Tower Strength Training on YouTube. So yeah, just want to talk about that, and until the next time, we'll see you at the whiteboard.